The cold wind howled through the dense forest as Jacob Langley gripped the steering wheel, his fingers tightening with frustration. The old pickup truck rattled down the bumpy road, its headlights cutting through the darkness. In the back, behind the rusted metal bars of a crude cage, a massive bear lay curled up, his thick fur matted and dirty. The bear barely moved, only his deep, tired breaths visible in the dim glow of the taillights. Jacob glanced at the bear through the rearview mirror, a sneer creeping onto his face. "Damn waste of space," he muttered under his breath. Brutus, as he had once proudly called him, was no longer the strong, powerful beast that had once made Jacob a fortune. For years, Brutus had been the star attraction at Jacob's roadside animal show, a massive, awe-inspiring grizzly forced to perform tricks for tourists. But now he was old, slower, weak, and Jacob had no use for weakness. It wasn't always like this. Brutus had once been Jacob's prized possession, bringing in crowds, money, and admiration. But the moment his steps became sluggish, his roars lost their power, and his body showed signs of aging, Jacob saw him as nothing more than a burden. He stopped feeding him properly, cut down on his care, and now he had made the final decision. Brutus was dead weight, and dead weight had to go. The truck came to a halt deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. Jacob stepped out, his breath forming clouds in the cold night air. He pulled a lever, and the cage door groaned open. "Go on," he barked. "Get out!" Brutus didn't move. His weary brown eyes met Jacob's, and for a moment there was something there. Recognition? Pain? Betrayal? Jacob scoffed. "Oh, don't look at me like that. You should be grateful I'm letting you go." Still, Brutus didn't budge. Jacob growled in frustration, grabbed a wooden rod from the truck bed, and slammed it against the cage. The loud clang sent birds scattering from nearby trees. "Move!" he shouted. Slowly, painfully, Brutus dragged himself forward. His massive paws touched the frozen ground, and he hesitated, sniffing the air. The forest was unfamiliar. For so many years, his world had been confined to a cage, bright lights, and human voices. This was something else. Jacob wasted no time. He slammed the cage shut, jumped back into the truck, and started the engine. As he sped away, he didn't bother looking back. To him, Brutus was already as good as dead. The night was merciless. The bitter cold bit through Brutus's thick fur, seeping into his aching bones. His stomach growled, a painful reminder that he hadn't eaten properly in days. Every muscle in his body screamed with exhaustion, but he had no choice. He had to move. Step by step, he pushed forward into the unknown. The forest was alive with sounds he didn't recognize. Branches cracking under unseen footsteps, distant howls, the rustle of leaves in the wind. He was not alone here. He stumbled upon a frozen stream, its surface glistening like glass under the moonlight. His dry throat burned, but when he pressed his snout to the ice, he found no relief. The water beneath was unreachable. A twig snapped behind him. He wasn't alone. Brutus turned his head sluggishly, his instincts dulled from years of captivity. Two glowing eyes peered at him from the darkness. Then another, and another. Wolves. They emerged from the shadows, their sleek bodies low to the ground, circling him with practiced precision. Brutus let out a low, warning growl, but it lacked the power it once had. He was weak, and they could sense it. The leader of the pack, a large black wolf, took a cautious step forward, teeth bared. Brutus braced himself, but he knew the truth. He didn't stand a chance. Then something strange happened. The black wolf paused, his sharp eyes studying Brutus. There was no fear in the wolf's gaze, no hesitation, only understanding. He sniffed the air, took a slow step back, and with a sharp bark, the other wolves followed. Within seconds, they disappeared into the night, leaving Brutus alone once more. He exhaled, his breath fogging the air. Why had they spared him? Exhausted beyond measure, Brutus collapsed into the snow. His body was too tired, too cold. His vision blurred, his heartbeat slowing. This was it. As the wind howled around him, his eyelids grew heavy. The darkness pulled him under. And then he heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, human. Brutus's ears twitched, but he didn't have the strength to lift his head. The footsteps stopped beside him. A voice, gentle, female, broke through the cold. "Oh, you poor thing." Then warmth, a blanket, hands, a scent. different from Jacob's, softer, kinder. And then for the first time in a long, long while, Brutus felt safe. Brutus's body was numb, his breathing shallow. His world had been nothing but cold, pain, and hunger for so long that the sudden warmth against his fur felt unreal, like a dream he didn't dare believe in. A soft voice murmured beside him, "You're safe now, big guy. Just hold on." The woman crouched beside the massive bear, her hands trembling as she adjusted the thick wool blanket around his massive frame. Emma Carter, a wildlife biologist who lived in a secluded cabin nearby, had been returning from her usual rounds when she had spotted something unusual in the snow. Tracks, large, uneven paw prints, dragging, as if whatever had made them had been too weak to walk properly. A bear, alone, in winter. Something was very, very wrong. She had followed the tracks, her gut twisting with unease until she found him. At first, she thought he was dead. His body lay still, partially covered in snow, his massive frame looking more like a fallen boulder than a living creature. But then she saw it, the faint rise and fall of his chest. He was alive. Barely. Emma knew she didn't have much time. Brutus felt his body being nudged, warmth pressing against his cold fur. His mind, still hazy, tried to make sense of it. He expected pain, cruelty, the sharp bite of a whip or a stick. But none came. Instead, a pair of strong arms struggled to shift his weight. He felt movement, then the soft crunch of snow beneath him. The air changed, less bitter, less biting. Heat. The scent of burning wood filled his nostrils. His fur brushed against something solid. A door frame? Emma gritted her teeth as she dragged him into her cabin's storage room, the only place large enough to hold him. She had no idea how she managed to get the massive bear inside, but she did, and now it was up to fate. She knelt beside him, running her hands gently over his fur. So many scars, so many signs of neglect. His ribs were faintly visible beneath his thick coat, his body a shell of the powerful creature he must have once been. She grabbed a towel, dipping it into a bowl of warm water, and carefully began cleaning the dried blood from his paws. "I don't know who did this to you," she whispered, anger tightening her throat. "But I promise you, they're never going to hurt you again." The morning sun barely touched the sky when Brutus's eyes flickered open. He was lying on something softer than the ground, a pile of blankets. His fur, once stiff with cold, now felt warm. The dull ache in his limbs remained, but something was different. He lifted his head sluggishly, his ears twitching at a sound, a soft hum. Emma sat a few feet away, stirring something in a pot over the fireplace. She glanced at him, her eyes meeting his. Unlike Jacob's, there was no cruelty in them, no expectation, just concern. "Morning, big guy," she said softly. "You had a rough night." Brutus blinked. He didn't understand the words, but her voice held no threat, only kindness. Emma slowly stood, moving cautiously toward a wooden bowl filled with freshly cooked oatmeal mixed with honey. She carefully set it down near him, stepping back to give him space. "I don't know what you used to eat," she said, "but you need food. Try it." Brutus sniffed the air. The scent was unfamiliar, but warm, sweet. His stomach clenched painfully. He was starving. For the first time in what felt like forever, he ate without fear. 2 days passed, then 3. Brutus grew stronger. The dullness in his eyes slowly faded, replaced with a quiet awareness. He moved more, stretched his stiff limbs, and even ventured outside into the small, fenced backyard Emma had built for recovering animals. Emma watched from a distance, careful not to push him. She knew he wasn't a pet. He was a wild animal, mistreated, abandoned, but still wild at heart. But something strange was happening. Brutus didn't try to escape. He didn't growl or act aggressively. He stayed. And Emma knew why. Trust. It was slow, fragile, but it was there. He would watch her through the cabin window as she worked. He would listen when she spoke, his ears twitching at her voice. And, on the rarest of occasions, he would let her sit beside him in the snow, just for a little while. She never pushed, never expected anything, and in return, Brutus began to heal. 1 week later, everything changed. Emma had gone into town to pick up supplies, leaving Brutus alone for the first time. She wasn't gone long, just a few hours, But when she returned, her heart nearly stopped. Her cabin door was wide open, her stomach clenched with fear. Had someone broken in? Had Brutus? She rushed inside, calling his name instinctively, even though she knew he wouldn't answer. The cabin was a mess. Drawers pulled open, her belongings scattered. A sharp, ugly feeling settled in her chest. Then she saw it. The back door, the one leading to the fenced yard, was broken. The wooden planks were split, claw marks gouged deep into the surface. Brutus was gone. Panic surged through her. Had he been taken? Had he run away? She grabbed her coat, ready to search the woods, when she noticed something in the snow outside. Tire tracks, deep, fresh, leading away from her home. A cold realization settled over her. Someone had been here. Someone had taken him. Emma's hands curled into fists. There was only one person who could have done this. Jacob. She didn't know how, she didn't know why, but she knew one thing for certain. Brutus was in danger again, and this time, she wouldn't let him down. Brutus's world had changed too fast. One moment, he had been lying in the snow, watching the sky shift from deep blue to golden streaks as the sun rose over the treetops. The next, rough hands, metal chains, and a familiar, hateful scent had surrounded him. Jacob. Brutus recognized the scent before his eyes could focus. The stench of old sweat, gasoline, and cheap alcohol. It was unmistakable. And the moment he smelled it, he knew. The past had come for him. His instincts screamed, his muscles tensed, but his body was still weak from starvation and the long years of captivity. Before he could react, a sharp sting tore through his skin. Something had jabbed into his side. A needle. His vision blurred. His legs wobbled, and then darkness. When Brutus woke, he was in a cage. Not the forest, not Emma's warm cabin. A cage. The iron bars felt too familiar, the cold metal beneath him pressing against his bones. He shifted, his movements slow and disoriented. His head pounded. His throat was dry. A rough voice cut through the haze. Well, well, look who's awake. Brutus didn't need to look to know who it was. Jacob. The man stood just outside the cage, arms crossed, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He smirked, but his eyes weren't mocking. They were calculating. You really thought you could just disappear, huh? He exhaled smoke, watching it curl into the air. Did you really think some tree-hugging idiot could change what you are? Brutus blinked slowly. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Jacob was angry, not just angry, desperate. Brutus had seen that look before. Jacob wasn't taking him back because he wanted to. He needed him. Jacob turned away, pacing. Do you have any idea what kind of mess you put me in, you oversized mutt? Business dried up after you left. No Brutus, no show, no money. And guess what? No money means people start asking questions, people I don't want to answer to. He kicked the cage, making the metal rattle. But now, I've got you back, and this time you're not going anywhere. Brutus didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just watched, because something inside him had changed. Jacob saw an old broken bear, a tool that had lost its edge. But Brutus had seen something Jacob hadn't, himself. In the days with Emma, he had begun to remember, not the tricks, not the cage, not the beatings, but who he truly was. A bear, a creature of the wild, a survivor. And survivors don't go down easy. Jacob didn't see it yet, but he would, because this time Brutus wasn't the same animal Jacob had abandoned. And soon, Jacob would realize his mistake. Emma's truck skidded across the muddy road, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. She had never felt rage like this before. Jacob, that monster. She had spent years studying wildlife cruelty cases, reading about men like him. Men who treated animals like property, like disposable objects. But she had never imagined it would hit this close to home. Her foot pressed harder on the gas. She didn't know where exactly Jacob had taken Brutus, but she had a good guess. There was only one place that made sense. Jacob's old rundown, roadside zoo. It wasn't a real zoo. It had been a disgusting, makeshift attraction where Jacob had kept Brutus and a few other animals in tiny, filthy enclosures. It had been shut down years ago after complaints about animal abuse. But Jacob had never officially left. Emma's jaw tightened. If he thought he could get away with this, he was wrong. The zoo was worse than Emma remembered. The wooden entrance sign was rotting, the paint peeling, the main lot was deserted, the old ticket booth covered in graffiti. But what made her stomach turn was the silence. No sounds of animals, no signs of life, except for one. A single light flickered inside the main building. She was getting Brutus back. She crept toward the entrance, her boots silent against the dirt. Her breath was steady, but her pulse hammered in her ears. She peered through a broken window and froze. Brutus, caged. Jacob was standing over him, talking to someone on the phone, his voice sharp and impatient. Emma couldn't make out every word, but one phrase made her blood run cold. "I don't care what you do with him. Just get me the money." Her stomach dropped. He was selling him. Her grip on the window tightened. She had seconds to decide. She could wait for the police, or she could act now. Brutus lifted his head slightly, his tired eyes locking onto hers through the window. And in that moment, Emma knew. There was no time to wait. She pulled a rusted metal pipe from the ground, her muscles tensed. No hesitation. Then with all her strength, she smashed the window. The sound was deafening. Glass shattered, raining onto the floor. Jacob spun around, cursing loudly. "What the—" Emma didn't give him time to react. She stormed through the broken window, her eyes burning with fury. "Let him go." Jacob blinked. Then to her disgust, he laughed. "You? What do you think you're gonna do, lady?" He gestured to Brutus. "That's a bear, a dangerous animal, and you want to play hero?" Emma didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her jacket and pulled out a gun. Not a real one, just a flare gun. But Jacob didn't know that. His smirk faltered. Emma took a slow step forward, her hands steady. "Last chance. Open the cage. Now." Jacob hesitated. Then his eyes flicked to the corner, a rifle leaning against the wall. Emma saw it. So did Brutus. And for the first time in weeks, Brutus moved like the bear he had once been. With a sudden, deep growl, he surged forward, ramming the cage bars with full force. The impact shook the entire building. The metal groaned, the rusted hinges snapping. Jacob barely had time to react before the cage door burst open. Brutus was free. Jacob's face drained of color. He scrambled toward his rifle. Too late. Brutus roared, a sound that shook the walls. It wasn't a roar of pain, of exhaustion. It was a roar of power, of freedom. Jacob stumbled backward, his legs shaking. "Easy now." Brutus stepped forward. Jacob tripped over the broken glass, falling hard onto the floor. His hands shook as he tried to crawl backward. But Brutus, buddy, remember me?" Brutus did remember, and this time he had the power. He loomed over Jacob, his massive shadow swallowing him whole. Emma didn't move. This wasn't her moment to interfere. This was Brutus's choice, and after everything Jacob had done, Brutus had made his decision. The air inside the rundown zoo was thick with tension. Jacob lay frozen on the ground, his breath ragged, his hands trembling as he stared up at the massive bear towering over him. Brutus was no longer the broken, obedient animal Jacob had controlled for years. His powerful shoulders heaved with each breath, his sharp eyes locked onto the man who had abandoned him, abused him, and stolen his freedom. For the first time in his life, Brutus held the power. Jacob swallowed hard, pressing his back against the cold concrete floor. Hey now, big guy," he stammered, his voice shaking. It was just business. You know that, right? Nothing personal." Brutus took a slow, deliberate step forward. Jacob flinched. Emma stood nearby, gripping the flare gun tightly, but she didn't interfere. This moment wasn't hers to control. This was Brutus's choice. Jacob let out a nervous laugh, sweat dripping down his forehead. "You don't want to hurt me, do you, Brutus? You remember all the good times, right? The crowds? The treats? I took care of you." Brutus let out a deep, guttural sound. Not a roar, not a growl, but something colder. A warning. Jacob's breath hitched. Okay, he sputtered, scrambling to his feet. "I get it. You're mad, I get it. But look, you won, okay? You're free. Just let me go." Brutus didn't move. Jacob took a hesitant step toward the door. His eyes flicked toward Emma, then to the broken cage. His mind was already calculating. If he could just get outside, get to his truck, he could escape. He lunged. Before Emma could react, Jacob snatched the rifle from the corner. His hands were shaky, his fingers fumbling with the trigger, but his desperation was stronger than his fear. Brutus reared up on his hind legs, his full-size monstrous in the dim light. Jacob panicked. He pulled the trigger. Click. The rifle jammed. Jacob's face went pale. No, no, no! Brutus moved. With a powerful swipe of his massive paw, he sent the rifle flying across the room. It clattered against the concrete, out of reach. Jacob stumbled back, eyes wide with terror. Brutus, please! The bear lunged. Jacob screamed as Brutus tackled him, slamming him against the ground. The air rushed from his lungs as the weight of the bear pinned him down. Emma's heart pounded. She knew Brutus had every reason to finish this. Every reason to end Jacob right here, right now. But then, something incredible happened. Brutus didn't attack. He could have. He could have torn Jacob apart, crushed him under his weight, made him suffer for every scar, every moment of pain. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped back. Jacob gasped for breath, his body shaking violently. He looked up, stunned, as Brutus stood over him, staring. Brutus had been beaten, starved, left to die. But in this moment, he did what Jacob never could. He showed mercy. Jacob, still trembling, scrambled backward, his hands gripping the cold floor. He looked at Emma, then back at Brutus, disbelief in his eyes. You're letting me go, he whispered. Brutus didn't respond, because Brutus wasn't like Jacob. Jacob was weak, cowardly, driven by greed and fear. But Brutus was better than him. Jacob didn't wait for another second. He clambered to his feet, tripping over his own panic as he ran toward the door. He didn't look back. Emma exhaled, lowering the flare gun. She turned to Brutus, her heart swelling with something she couldn't explain. Pride. Jacob had been right about one thing. Brutus wasn't just an animal, he was something more. And this time, he was finally free. Dawn broke over the forest, casting golden light over the trees as Emma and Brutus walked side by side. The old roadside zoo was no more. Emma had called the authorities, and by midday, animal welfare officers had arrived, taking evidence of the years of cruelty Jacob had inflicted. He wouldn't escape the consequences this time. But Emma and Brutus, they were done with that place. They walked in silence, the cool morning air filling their lungs. Brutus's fur glowed in the sunlight, his wounds healing, his steps steadier than ever before. Emma glanced at him. You really are incredible, you know that, she murmured. Brutus didn't understand the words, but he understood her, and for the first time in his life, he belonged to no one. The forest stretched endlessly before them, golden sunlight filtering through the towering trees. The cold of winter was still present, but it no longer felt cruel. It felt alive, fresh, a new beginning. Brutus walked beside Emma, his massive paws crunching softly against the frost-covered ground. His steps were stronger now, more assured. The bear that had once been caged, starved, and beaten down was gone. In his place stood a survivor. Emma stole a glance at him, her heart swelling with relief. She had worried at first, worried that he would be too weak to recover, too broken to survive on his own. But every step he took proved her wrong. She had saved him once. But now he didn't need saving anymore. The thought made her chest tighten, because she knew what had to happen next. Brutus had a choice now. He was no longer chained, no longer a prisoner. He had his strength back, his instincts returning with each passing day. He belonged to the wild, and she had to let him go. Emma stopped walking. Brutus noticed immediately. He turned his massive head, his dark eyes studying her in quiet curiosity. She forced a smile. This is it, big guy, she murmured. You're free. The words tasted strange, heavy. Brutus didn't move. Emma inhaled sharply, blinking back the sting in her eyes. She had always known this moment would come. It was the right thing to do. He wasn't a pet. He wasn't hers to keep. He had survived Jacob. He had survived years of captivity. Now he deserved to live. You can go now, she whispered, her voice barely above the wind. You're finally home. Brutus blinked. His ears twitched. He looked at the forest ahead, the open wilderness stretching into endless possibilities. And then he did something that made Emma's breath catch. He stepped closer, not away, not toward the trees, toward her. Emma's heart pounded. Brutus! He pressed his massive head against her shoulder, the weight of it gentle but deliberate. A goodbye. A thank you. Emma swallowed the lump in her throat and ran her fingers through his thick fur, memorizing the warmth, the strength. She would never forget this moment. She pulled away slowly, nodding toward the trees. Go on, big guy. Live. Brutus held her gaze for a long, quiet moment. Then, with one last look, he turned and walked into the wild. Emma stood there until he disappeared into the trees, until the only thing left was silence. A tear slipped down her cheek, but she smiled. This was how it was meant to be. Because true kindness isn't about keeping something for yourself. It's about knowing when to let go. Cruelty is weakness. Power is not in control, but in compassion. Jacob believed strength came from dominating others. He thought he could take and take without consequences. But true power isn't about control, it's about choice. Brutus had every reason to seek revenge, to become the monster Jacob had tried to turn him into. But he didn't. Because real strength is in mercy. And true freedom is in knowing when to walk away.